Tyler locked the cabin door. The mountain air was crisp and cold. He breathed deeply, savoring the silence. The woods around him were dark and still. It was time to go. Tyler turned and walked towards his car. The gravel crunched under his boots. A lone owl hooted in the distance. He unlocked the car and settled in. The engine turned over with a reassuring roar. Tyler switched on the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees lining the narrow road. He pulled away from the cabin, leaving the solitude behind. Tyler began the long drive down the mountain. The road twisted and turned, hugging the mountainside. The fog was thick tonight, clinging to the trees. It obscured the familiar landmarks, making the journey seem longer. Tyler focused on the road ahead, his headlights the only guide. A strange unease started to creep into his mind. The silence, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. He turned on the radio, hoping to break the silence. Static. He flipped through channels, finding only more static. The silence returned, heavier than before. Tyler gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He just wanted to get off this mountain. The headlights flickered across a figure by the roadside. A woman. She was shrouded in the fog, her features indistinct. Tyler slowed down, his heart pounding. Was she stranded? He rolled down the window, the cold air rushing in. "Need some help?" he called out, his voice tight. The woman turned her head slightly towards him. Tyler couldn't make out her face in the darkness. She didn't answer. He hesitated, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. Then, the fog seemed to swirl around her, obscuring her from view. When it cleared, she was gone. Tyler continued driving, his unease growing into full-blown fear. He told himself it was just the fog playing tricks on him. But the image of the woman lingered in his mind. He rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. There she was again, standing on the edge of the road. How did she get here? He had just passed this spot. This time, he could see her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits. Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly rolled up his window, his hand shaking. He couldn't take his eyes off her. The sight of the gas station sign filled Tyler with relief. A beacon of light in the oppressive darkness. He pulled into the deserted station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He got out of the car, desperate to escape the confines of his vehicle. The air felt cleaner, lighter here. He went inside, the bell above the door jingling. The warmth of the small store washed over him. An old man sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. Tyler nodded a greeting, feeling a surge of gratitude for the company. He bought a cup of coffee, his hands still trembling. He stood outside, sipping the hot coffee, trying to calm his nerves. The night was eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the gas station lights. He took another sip, feeling the warmth spread through his body, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled in his bones. He glanced at the road, the fog swirling ominously. It was as if the mist was alive, moving with a purpose, hiding secrets within its depths. The fog seemed thicker tonight, more oppressive, and it made him uneasy. He convinced himself that the woman was gone. She had to be. He had seen her disappear into the fog, hadn't he? He shook his head, trying to dispel the lingering doubts. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, he told himself. A figment of his imagination. Nothing more. He had been under a lot of stress lately, and it was starting to take its toll. He needed to get a grip, to stop letting his mind wander to dark places. He finished his coffee and tossed the cup in the trash. The act felt final, like he was discarding his fears along with the empty cup. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. As he turned back to his car, he saw her. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. She was there, standing by the gas pumps, just as he had feared. She stood by the gas pumps, her pale face illuminated by the flickering light. The light cast eerie shadows on her face, making her look almost ghostly. He couldn't believe his eyes. She was closer now, her features sharp and unsettling. Her presence was almost tangible, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about her that was deeply unnerving. Her eyes, dark and vacant, were fixed on him. They seemed to bore into his soul, searching for something. He couldn't look away, trapped by her gaze. Tyler froze, the coffee cup slipping from his grasp and shattering on the ground. The sound of the breaking cup snapped him out of his trance, but the fear remained. He fumbled for his keys, his breath catching in his throat. His hands were shaking, making it difficult to find the right key. He needed to get out of there, to escape from whatever this was. The night had taken a turn for the worse, and he could feel the danger closing in. He threw himself into the car and slammed the door. The night was cold, and the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. He could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him, but there was no turning back now. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Every second felt like an eternity as he struggled to fit the key into the ignition. His mind raced with thoughts of what he was leaving behind and what lay ahead. The engine roared to life, a small victory in the midst of chaos. The dashboard lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow inside the car. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He threw the car into gear and sped out of the gas station, tires screeching. He didn't look back. The sound of the tires on the wet asphalt echoed in his ears, a reminder of the urgency of his escape. He just drove, his heart pounding in his chest. The road ahead was a blur, and his mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination. He had to keep going, no matter what. He had to get off this mountain. The winding roads were treacherous, and every turn felt like a gamble. The headlights cut through the darkness, but it was never enough to see what lay beyond the next bend. He had to get away from her. The thought of her sent a shiver down his spine. He couldn't let her catch up to him. He couldn't let her control his life any longer. But the road seemed endless. The mountains loomed on either side, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. He felt like he was driving into a void, with no end in sight. The fog clung to the car, suffocating him. It was as if the night itself was trying to swallow him whole. He could barely see a few feet ahead, and every shadow seemed to hide a new danger. And then he felt it. A jolt. The car shuddered, and his heart skipped a beat. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The car sputtered, the engine coughing. The dashboard warning lights flickered, casting an ominous red glow. He knew something was terribly wrong. He frantically pumped the gas pedal, but it was no use. The engine's protests grew weaker, and he could feel the car losing power. Panic set in as he realized he was losing his only means of escape. The car coasted to a stop, the engine dying completely. He was stranded. The silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to close in around him. He was alone, with no one to turn to and nowhere to go. The weight of his failure settled heavily on his shoulders, and he knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. He was trapped. He looked around frantically. The fog was so thick he could barely see the road. He was alone. He fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. He was completely cut off. Then he heard it. A soft tapping on the window behind him. He slowly turned his head. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide and pleading. Her breath fogged the window. He could see her mouth moving, but no sound came through the glass. He recoiled from her touch, his heart pounding in his ears. He blinked. The face was gone. It had been there just a moment ago, staring at him through the thick fog, eyes wide with an unspoken terror. He could still feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked around again, his heart racing. The fog seemed to be receding, but the eerie silence of the night was deafening. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce through the dense mist, but it was like looking into a void. He could see the faint outline of the road ahead. It was barely visible, a ghostly path leading him away from this nightmare. He had to get out of here. The urgency of the situation gripped him, and he knew that staying any longer could mean facing whatever had just vanished. He took a deep breath and tried the ignition. The engine turned over, a comforting sound in the oppressive silence. The dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a dim glow inside the car. He felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. He threw the car into gear and pulled away, leaving the woman behind. She had appeared out of nowhere, her face pale and eyes hollow. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. Who was she? And why was she out here, in the middle of nowhere? He didn't stop driving until he reached the highway. The familiar sight of the open road brought a semblance of normalcy, but his hands were still trembling. He pulled over to the side of the road, his body still shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted and on edge. He looked back at the road he had just traveled. It was dark and deserted, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just escaped. The rearview mirror showed nothing but an empty road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The fog had swallowed it whole. It was as if the road had never existed. He had escaped, but the memory of the encounter lingered. The fog, the woman, the vanishing face, they were all etched into his mind. But he knew he would never forget the chilling encounter on the mountain road. It was a night that would haunt him forever, a mystery that would remain unsolved. The road ahead was clear, but the shadows of the past loomed large, a constant reminder of the unknown lurking in the fog.